Welcome back, listeners, for another great episode of the Smart Retirement Podcast. This is your co-host, Matt Hollander, joined here with co-host Jeff Shulham. Jeff, how are we doing today?
Excellent. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited for this episode. As we had talked about in our previous episode, we do have a guest today by the name of Allan Milham with a company called Questage. And really excited to kind of get some insight from Allan. Allan is a executive coach or a master certified coach who has more than 25 years of experience working with teams and individuals in corporate settings, really helping them get their mindset and everything in order to kind of finish out the last parts of their lives and keep them motivated through that stage 3, if we will, of their working years. So Allan works with a lot of high impact leaders in big companies, and I think it's going to bring a different dynamic to today's show than we've really talked about here in the past. But I do think it's going to be right up our alley, Jeff. I mean, we just got done doing a virtual endurance race, which you and I both competed in with a couple teammates. But I like to take some of this back to racing occasionally, and because Jeff, I mean, that's one of our passions for sure, and if we can figure out a way to bring passion into what we do on a daily basis, I think it makes it much more enjoyable. But when we look at endurance racing and you're thinking to yourself, okay, we've got to maintain a pace that's consistent through 3, 6, 12, 24 hours, whatever that race may be. Does it make sense to push hard at the beginning just to fade out later because now you've worn through your equipment and you're just not, excited to do it anymore? Or Jeff, like you mentioned, is you take kind of that turtle approach maybe and, turn it to rabbit mode towards the end? Or, do you just kind of stay consistent all the way through and risk the, you go long enough that maybe you didn't attain what you're wanting to? Whether it be, Jeff, we talk about those mini retirement vacations and things, and are we able to attain those things, right? So I think Allan's going to be a really good person to have on the show today, just kind of how to shift that mindset into a position where we feel that relevance and positivity in our lives at that that final stage of our working years.
Are you saying life is like an endurance race, Matt?
I think that might be what I'm getting at.
I think so too. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of different approaches, right? Do you want to burn out a little bit too soon, or do you want to think about it for the long haul and have a consistent, steady life? Yeah, there's definitely different approaches, and that's what I think this podcast is all about. So I'm glad you brought that up about the endurance racing. And I know that Allan also has worked with some Olympians, and I'm kind of hoping to hear his opinions on working with top athletes, because I know they have a certain mindset that all of us can learn from.
Sure.
That could be useful for us as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we'll be able to come away from today's episode with is, in our working years, I think discipline in a lot of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis and things, I think is going to be pretty important. I think Allan will probably reinforce that a little bit as we go through this episode.
Well, I think that hopefully he'll bring up the mindset of how Americans have a different point of view on working versus, let's say, the Europeans.
Sure, or the Asians,
right? I mean, we have this Puritan ethic of work hard, play hard type of mentality, where the emphasis in Europe is more, I would think, with balance and vacations and the time off. I mean, just look at the differences in vacation time in Europe. I think the average vacation time in Europe is 4 weeks. Well, you're lucky to get 1 week here, sure, maybe 2. I mean, they have a completely different mindset towards that, and I think that, nothing to say wrong about the Puritan ethics, but is it the best way? Can we make a difference and maybe earlier on and have more balance about that,
Sure.
and not have to worry as much about changing when you retire. I would think that it's hard going from work to nothing, right? And so I'm sure he's going to get into that. So I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think to kind of bounce off of that, Jeff, is looking at the the workforce in like the Asian countries, right? The totally different work ethic than both Europe and the United States. So, there's definitely a balance that has to happen, and I'm not saying one's more correct than the other, right? So it'll be interesting to kind of get Allan's perspective on that. So, Jeff, why don't we do this? Why don't we go ahead and take a quick break, and when we come back, we will have Allan Milham of Questage on the show with us, and we can kind of dive in and ask him some questions and pick his brain. So I'm looking forward to it. Listeners, stick around. We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back, smart retirees, from that short break. As promised, we are joined here today by Allan Milham, founder of Questage. Allan, how are you doing today?
I'm in good shape.
Well, that's great to hear. That's great to hear. Listeners, Allan actually is out here in the Phoenix area with me, so we're not melting yet. And I think the rain has... maybe the rain's dried up for a little bit. We can enjoy some of what we have come to know as our Arizona summer, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's great.
Allan, I mean, you and I have got a chance to talk a little bit, but why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about who you are and what Questage is and kind of how you can help some of our listeners?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for this opportunity. Questage was founded a couple years ago based on my work for the past 25 years, working with executive leaders globally, just around executive performance, being able to elevate their impact in their leadership roles. And I started my career as a career consultant in San Francisco in the 90s. And I had an experience back then that it never left me. We had the privilege of working with really top-notch executives. You couldn't walk in off the street. The company afforded these programs, and it was mostly out of merger and acquisition that we would have the opportunity to work with amazing leaders. And like with a CFO, if it's an acquisition, one got the job, the other one didn't. And I'll never forget a couple years into my work there with an individual who's nearing 60, I think, and when he walked into my office, I just found his mood really off, right? And I was looking at his resume. It was just absolutely stellar. Great college pedigree, seamless work through his 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And this was the first time that he was without work. It was as if we were in a room that was just all white walls, and there was nothing on the walls to represent who he was. There was something about when his business card and his title was taken away, there was no there. And that was a sad moment because I could just think, wow, you have accomplished so much, right? But from his perspective, because he put so much of his identity tied to his work, that it really it was a bit depressing. And there's a phenomena in America that's been in place for decades, and I haven't seen it in Europe, in countries abroad. In that proverbial cocktail conversation, when you walk into a room and you meet someone, and the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, "So what do you do?"
Right.
And it's we put so much onto that, right? If I had lived in France when I was in college, and it wasn't what you did, it was where was your family from? Where do you come from, right? And the stories of your family and the richness of that versus our work identity. And I just never forgot that as I moved forward into my work as an executive coach and leadership strategist. And it occurred to me about 3 years ago, just woke up with it to say, a lot of my executives were getting ready to retire. They'd won the money game, but they were still in their late 50s, early 60s, and with a deep desire to continue to be productive, even though that their full-time careers were wrapping up. And that's really where the seeding of Questage came, is to really to help top-performing leaders to create a really compelling roadmap for the third act of their life, right? And so that's really the genesis of and we made up the word through the word of question, through the word of quest and stage and age, and all that is built into Questage as a word. And we're really here to really create high impact transitions. High impact transitions for the third act of life folks. And a part of what's unique about us is we want to work with clients who desire to continue to lead. Because we have a gap right now. We have so many boomers retiring, and until the millennials, we need another decade before the millennials will be nearing 40 to 50, where they can sort of cover the whole. And we need to we can't afford to lose the leaders' wisdom and the sage advice and the knowledge they have. And so candidates that come to us have to have a desire to pay it forward. I don't care if it's consulting, foundation work, charity, volunteer, it doesn't matter. But as you well know, the era of what I'll call retirement, because I think that word's just going to fade away in the next decade or two. Our clients do not like that word because they don't want to retire, right? At best, it's pro-tirement, right? And so we really want to what we do is create compelling roadmaps. So our clients wake up on Monday mornings excited for the week. They're feeling relative. They're feeling productive. They've got purpose. And their mindset is one of positivity. We've seen a lot of sad stories where people, finish their full-time careers, particularly the male and the white male who have got so much ego and power in their success, and now they're isolated, right? And so we want to make it a team sport. We want to build out their networks and to be able to have them purposely, feeling engaged for the remaining decades of their life. I'm sure you've heard the statement of the 60s being the go-go years, the 70s being the slow go, and the 80s being sort of no-go. And I think in this next decade, keep pushing it out. I'm reminded of an amazing man I met I met him about 3 years ago. 88 years old, had a very successful business, and I said to him, when are you thinking of slowing it down? And he said, it's funny. I just talked to my wife about that last night, and I'm ready to cut it in half and take it down to about 40 hours a week. I think now is that I'm 88 years old, and I just cracked up because he had all the energy of a 50-year-old, right? Wow. And he was very, very passionate, and ended on a sad note because he didn't survive COVID. And but I thought, well, he went out with a bang because he just had all the right wiring and the mindset. And he said, I have a lot of my friends that are looking really old and they don't do anything, but that's not my story. And I think that's so inspirational to think that we can have that high productivity in the third act of our lives.
Sure.
Do you have any?
I want to... Go ahead.
I was just wondering, is there some statistics out there of those that maybe that stay productive and don't really retire per se, and seeing if that actually increases their life expectancy, staying productive, having a purpose every day, and so forth. Has there been any surveys of any sort that you know of?
Yeah, it's a great one, because one survey that we found had to do with really how they, sort of looking at what they called new retirement, right? And how it's impacting people at the end of their careers. And in this survey, 83% of the pre-retirees said they expect to live their best life in the third act of their life, which is awesome, right? 83% also said they'd rather save more money so they don't have to cut back in retirement. So you've got sort of a future thinking of proactive saving. And 81% said there are more jobs and career opportunities for people in post-retirement than ever before. And we're seeing that play out, right? So there's a very positive element. Now, this is one survey, right? The other, we have to recognize, I think we've got sort of a split, sort of tale of two cities, if you will, given the pandemic. Forbes came out, or sorry, not Forbes, Bloomberg came out in April talking about sort of a new mindset around more people retiring earlier, right? Wanting to use their life now and to enjoy that bucket list now versus waiting for the future. And in their findings, they talked about the fact that there are, there were millions of people who are sort of pulling it out early just to be able to live that life they want. Conversely, you still have a large population, sort of, I think the last one we looked at was 1 in 3 baby boomers who will have to work well into their 70s because they don't have the retirement reserves. And some feel they'll have to work the rest of their lives. So you have a bit of a split, which concerns me in the bigger scheme of, hierarchy. Where Questage focuses is really on the top performing leader because they have influence and power and resources to make a difference, and that's why we really believe leadership needs to continue well into the third act of your life, so you really can help your communities, help the world, right? Help those areas that you're passionate about to make a difference, and that's really at the premise of what we're about.
Have you found working with some of your clients that the younger generation isn't interested on what wisdom the older generation has and how to deal with that? I know I've experienced that personally with a nephew who's creating apps for a company that he founded, but at the same time, my father and I were in the software business for 24 years. Same thing, but he's never come to us for advice. And at the same time, I've tried to give it to him, and I think he thinks he knows better.
Just out of curiosity, how old is he?
He was 19 when he created his first app, and now he's 25.
Got it. So they're and we don't have a ton of research on this because it keeps shifting, right? If you look at corporate America, that's where the leadership void, if you're looking at who owns the culture of businesses, if the senior leaders are leaving. Let's take Wells Fargo, for example, right? I mean, you have a lot of, old bank, a lot of players, and a lot of people now transitioning, right? And so when you're looking at large organizations, to have that young buck say, well, I don't need any advice, I'm just going to do my thing. Well, what about the 100 years of culture and the 100 years of history, and particularly with those leaders that have spent their entire careers, 30 or 40 years there, and they leave, who's overseeing that transition from a cultural perspective that makes it competitive and makes the new worker want to be there? Who you're referencing to has much more an entrepreneurial mindset, right? I doubt highly that he will ever go into a big, authoritarian corporate, with hierarchy, because it sounds like he's going to be much more of an entrepreneurial mindset. And so that kind of mindset may not really care about that aged third act of life. But I think there are many in the corporate context that do value that and want to learn from it, right? The Gen Zs that are coming in, basically, he's either at the end of the millennial or a Z, but what we're learning about the Gen Zs is that they want the history. They want to be at the table. They want to be able to learn. They recognize they don't have the decades of skills, but they want to be hungry for it, and they demand a self-aware leader. And so it's those learning organizations and those learning businesses that are going to attract the Gen Z population, because they want, it matters to them if the business is doing well, they're doing well for the world, and that they're value aligned. And that's a little different, certainly, from the boomer generation. So you've got a lot of, and the other element is you're going to have 70-year-old people reporting to 30-year-old managers, which is going to be an interesting dynamic. We've never had so many generations in a workforce, right? From 20 to 70, you're scanning, four generations there, and that's also something we'll have to watch to see how that plays out.
That's great. Allan, if I came to you when I was about to retire, what kind of questions would you ask me? And a better thought would be, what would be that question that if I had 10 years, if you had asked that 10 years earlier, I might have done something different?
Right. So, well, the first part of that is, in fact, it's on the website. We have an Are You Ready assessment. It's 10 questions, and it allows you just to sort of take a pause to reflect on, are you ready for this kind of journey? And you get a percentage, and a lot of people who take it aren't ready, or not ready. They're not ready for Questage, right? And the kinds of things we're looking for is, looking at how's your energy about your third act of life. Some are just burned out; they want to be unplugged, and that's not a Questage client, right? We're looking for the energy. We're looking for their hunger around being productive. We're looking for the mindset of being are they a learning leader? Do they continue to be curious about life as a student versus feeling like they know it all? One of the interesting dynamics that we're seeing that's new with retirement communities is they're now they're building them next to universities. So in fact, Matthew, we write down at ASU, there is now a huge, I don't know how much they spend on it. It's a gorgeous facility that's actually on ASU campus, and it's a retirement facility. And they have free education, they have free access to classrooms. And what we're seeing is, for a percentage of that third act of life, they're hungry for knowledge. So one of the things we check for that is, because some are done. Some are just they're burned out, they're done. They want to be unplugged. We've got, in last year, according to one research, the average American retiree watched 48 hours of TV per week. Now, that's not good news for us, right? In the next 20 years, boomers will have something like 2.5 trillion hours less to fill as they come out of their careers. So for us, we want to tap in and get into the mindset of those that are not done. They don't want to give it up. They don't want to pause. They don't want to slow down. They want to we got to rewire it. We have dear friends that she's 70, I think he's 80. They've won the money game, and they will never, when they go to a party, they do not sit down, but they stand and mingle. And if anyone comes up and says, "Hi, I'm George," well, what was your career like? What did you do? They politely say, "Excuse me, I've got to go take a phone call," and they leave because they're not interested in talking about where they've been. They want to talk to people like, who are you? Where do you live? What's going on? What do you care about? And I think that's just fascinating, right? Because, a lot of people, when we retire, we get caught up into the where we've been. And Questage is about where are you going, right? And with that mindset, and it's contagious. People want to be around it, right? Absolutely. So looking 10 years back, right, to get someone that's 45, that's where I think you guys are coming in, right? To really do the pre-planning, get ahead of it, right? And to be able to, it is about structure. It is about really, being way more mindful. And at least what I'm seeing, I don't know, you guys know this better than I do, but all my millennial kids, right, who are in their 25, 30, they are so disciplined when it comes to financial management and saving. And, the boomers lost out greatly because we just didn't have the education. We weren't getting that in high school. I mean, I took an accounting class, but there was nothing about financial management and planning, and your industry is now doing that beautifully to educate that will allow for really more meaningful lives, not tied to the job, tied to the having to save for the future. One of Harvard's most fascinating sold out classes a couple of years ago was about happiness. And this professor just nailed it. In fact, his book is called Happier. And he really makes the distinctions of people who are caught up in the rat race. And for a lot of boomers, they got into the rat race. Head down, plow through, save for later. My happiness will come later. And he talks about, how do we get that happiness into current state, right?
Absolutely.
And I believe so. We've got so much profound change on this topic, and it's going to be one really to note and be interested in the coming decade plus.
Now, speaking of books, Alan, you've got a book or two as well, don't you?
Right. I've written 3 books in the last 20 years. My last one is called Out of the Question: How Curious Leaders Win, and we really talk about the distinction between the learner leader versus the knower leader. And the knower leader is the old general, the old command and control, do as I see, keep your emotions at home, chuck, and as I said earlier, the new generation of workers are no longer going to tolerate that. The bully leader is going to be out of vogue quickly. It's kept me nicely employed, though, for 25 years. But the new leader, this learner leader, is more like the guide, right? Who's willing to be curious, willing to not, I don't know the answers, but we'll figure it out. Willing to be vulnerable, willing to show that. So in that book, we just talk about the distinctions between those. And a lot of that thinking goes into Questage, right? Because who we're really attracting is that learner, third act of life person that's wanting their third act, as I said earlier, wanting their third act of life to be their best act of life. And
it's funny you say that, because we close the podcast with my typical, let's go out and make the rest of our lives the best of our lives. So talk about the third part being the best part. I think that's pretty cool. I think it's well aligned. I do want to talk a little bit more about Questage, and Jeff, I know you've got some questions, but we're about halfway-ish through our segment here. So Alan, if you would, just tell our listeners how to find Questage, how to find you, how can they connect with you?
Everything is at questage.com, Questage, questage.com. And they're both on the leadership side as well as high impact transitions. There's a video, a little 1 minute and 40-second video that sort of makes the case visually around, what we're talking about here, as well as that assessment, Are You Ready? That can help them to see if could we serve as a resource for them, and if they're not, we give them other resources. Certainly, there are a lot of resources out there to help all people who are nearing the third act of life.
Okay. Jeff,
do you find that the type of leader that you have as clients are also, I assume, have somewhat of a feeling that they want to leave a legacy, and do you help them with that in some fashion or form?
Absolutely. So the first phase of the discovery of the Questage process is the discovery process, where we actually have 2 very powerful assessments. One is out of Cape Town, South Africa, called the Integrative Enneagram, that really helps the client really understand their core motivations. I've been using this tool for many years for leaders, but it's also very relevant as we're looking at the third act of life, of just to really understand, what are my true core motivations, so that I can really feed those, right, and have it as a baseline. And one of the reflective exercises certainly is around legacy, and it's having us cast forward 3 decades to ask the question, as you're on that comfortable Tempur-Pedic final bed, right? And you're reflecting back on your life, what matters and what's most important to you. I've been using the legacy piece for decades as for leaders, and it's a bigger game now with Questage because it's now time limited. Asking a 30-year-old what matters to you, over the next 60 years is very different than what matters to you over the next 20 years. And so by really reflecting that out, allows us then to build in a roadmap to ensure that legacy can actually be created.
Awesome. And as far as being able to help them with their bucket list, Is that something that you get involved with as well, or is it more about dealing with the mindset? And I know that you had mentioned so much of us in America believes our work is our identity and who we are. And I know I kind of went through that recently. And, it was very hard because, my friends and family knew I was that guy because of, the profession I was
Right.
in and so forth.
Right.
And it made me, I was very proud of that situation. And now all of a sudden I don't have that title anymore. And it was tough, but I survived. But how do you help your clients move through that?
Well, we operate on both sides of the coin, right? Sort of what I'll call the hard side is around, reflective exercises and some assessments that allow us to lay a foundation for that roadmap. And in part of that is actually building out productivity scenarios. We actually go out 3 decades, depending on the age of the client. We tend to work 54 to 68 is sort of our sweet spot. Not that I've had 70 plus old clients. It's just energetically we noticed a little bit of a difference for what we're up to in the third half, last third of the baby boomer population. And so we can look at both on the hard side, how do you want to be productive? You have every right to continue to earn if you desire that. And so we build out scenarios based on what we, out of that discovery process, to begin looking at, is this, creating a charity, a foundation, volunteer? Is this developing, my last client, 72 years of age, is consulting vibrantly in his area, in his interest, and perfectly engaged. And then the second productivity is really life productivity. And so in that exercise, we're looking out 3 decades and just asking the question, what matters to you? As you mentioned, your bucket list. This is where that comes in, around travel, lifestyle, health, relationships, family, friends, etc. And so and then what we do is we take that data and put it into a really elegant, easy to follow roadmap that allows for the client, and obviously this is a team sport with their partner or spouse and with their kids or grandkids. So there's a way that it all comes together in a really, to really speak to the new identity of what I'm doing, moving it forward versus living in my past. And one of the things you're talking about, Jeff, is when you talk about your transition, right? Well, there's ego in what we do, right? And there's healthy ego, and then there's sort of non-healthy ego. And one of my greatest teachers is Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R, who is just an amazing visionary and so steeped in profound knowledge. He's written a number of books, and one of my favorites is called Falling Upward. And what he does so beautifully in that book is really talks about the first half of life versus the second half of life. And for, the first half is coming into the world and your family and your education and college, hopefully, and then work and life partners and families and career growth and all that, sort of the doing of the first half of your life, right, with healthy ego. And he makes the case that the second half of life, you can define what that means age-wise, but let's just say it's 50, right, or 55, is just offering the perspective that with all that you've accomplished, how about the human beingness of your life, right? Sort of just checking that ego and asking the question, what really matters? And that's where the legacy piece ties in, to say, well, what's really important? For years, I would get clients who had looked so great on their resumes were stellar, but they came to me with a statement like, is this all there is? And I'm like, well, it's pretty impressive, right? But they got to a place where they realized that it wasn't about the title, the compensation, or whatever. It was like, I'm yearning for something more. And so Richard Rohr does a great job of just allowing us to have that inflection point to really think what matters to us. How do we want to play it out, right, as we move into that third act of life.
Is it as simple as saying don't sweat the small stuff? Is that the big lesson that we learn when we get older?
Yeah, well, great. There's a great book on that exact topic. And, yes, and I mean, I would always love it to be that simple. And at Questage, we try to make it that simple, but it really depends on the client. And ultimately, we have to just lower the mirror. We have to, at the end of the day, we all just have to, as we enter our third act of life, is to lower the mirror and just simply look at what you see, and to really say what matters, right? And then again, as you brought up earlier, what matters for me to really focus on, so I can be proud of the last act of my life, right? That I can really, be really proud of what I accomplished in addition to everything that's occurred prior. And again, just think. I mean, I was raised that you retired and there was a gold watch. Never really quite understood that concept, but it's, and then you went fishing or knitting or there were rocking chairs and and it's we originally had the title of this Questage High Impact Retirement. And our as we tested it, they just blew that word out, right? They're just, no, I'm not retiring. I don't want that in my vocabulary. Never do I want that in my vocabulary. So we really are pivoting to some profound change as we shift, as the baby boomers, move up and out, and the next generation comes in, and it's all fast paced and moving, but. What I think is most fascinating for the boomers is that they really value self-sufficiency. They pride themselves on decision-making and on still being competitive and optimistic in nature. And to the beloved guy that was cutting his work week at 88 down to 40 hours, that's the kind of mindset. Not that you have to work 40 hours, but we really do talk about mindset. And if you've ever traveled into nursing homes, some of them are very sad because they're unplugged and they're, they've given up and they feel that the world, particularly with technology, is going so fast. And we really want to change that narrative. It's never too late to learn.
Well, you said earlier about trying to figure out really what matters. I think part of that is difficult, maybe, or maybe it's just different. Because as you get older, that you understand what that really means, what matters more so. You have that wisdom. But for someone like Matt, he's going to have a different version, I think, of what matters at his age. So is there something that maybe you can generalize what you've seen as an answer to some of your clients as far as what they think is what matters, to maybe give the younger generation insight to what to expect maybe as you get older?
Well, great question, and we have a research team working on that very one. We're actually interviewing 1,000 people in the third act of life across the United States, and that's one of the questions. So stay tuned. It won't be done until the end of Q4. But it is, I think you and I can sort of look at how we were raised, and when you thought about your grandparents and the level of productivity and what they did, they're very different. It's just a whole different world compared to where we are today. And my hope is that the Matts of the world will be curious to learn from the wisdom, the elders, right? If you look at other countries and look at Native American cultures, the elder are revered, right? They're sacred. They and we need to do a way better job in the United States on this topic. To be curious and to want to listen to the legacy and the learnings and to apply that. Otherwise, you're just working between your ears. And we really believe that in the third act of life, as all life should be, is evoking curiosity to just be able to be in awe and wonder and to learn, so that you can become the best version of yourselves, no matter what age you are.
Once again, maybe a general question or asking a general answer. Maybe it's a little misleading because your clients are probably already have enough funds to, let's say, retire happily, but is there something that you've seen that says that having more money makes you happier in your retirement versus not?
Yeah. So we have no research on that. You certainly have research on the question generally. I mean, you've seen the research on lottery winners that win the whole thing, and then years later, guess where they are? Right back to where they began. And I'm very much aware that I've stated a couple times that I'm talking about leaders who have won the money game. But I want to be clear, it is not about money. I mean, we focus because that's where I have worked for the last 25 years. It's just a natural extension of what I've done to now really help those leaders be able to pay it forward. And because they have financial affluence, they have greater means to actually do that for their communities or for whatever matters. But it's not tied to the happiness of it. They have influence and power with it. But anyone coming into their third act of life, has the opportunity to really check to say, how is your mindset, right? Are you coming from a place of prosperity and, feeling good and optimistic, or are you coming from a place of scarcity and pessimism? And what we know is that productivity and happiness allows your lives to live longer. That's now proven in the field of positive psychology, that the disposition of a positive outlook and a productive life allows people just literally to live 4 to 5 years longer than one that has more of a darker viewpoint. And so, and I believe, mindset is so important in this conversation because, when you it sounds like you've done an amazing job with your transitions, right? And you sound like you've got a very productive, active, full life going on right now. And sometimes the saddest person is the one that I had a client recently that was out of work for probably 8 months during the pandemic. And he's such a top performer that 8 months really was sort of crushing for him because he got out of the fast moving current of the life he enjoyed. And then he began to question relevancy. He began to question whether, he at 71 could be able to, be competitive with 30 and 40-year-olds. And he's the one I mentioned earlier where he's back in the game and crushing it, right? But we have to ultimately just to check the mindset to make sure that we're on the right side of the equation. Very early on in my career, when I was a career consultant, we had the privilege of sponsoring the U.S. Olympics, and I had the privilege of working with some Olympians in the San Francisco office. And what amazed me about them that informed my entire career around performance coaching was the fact that with no training, every one of them had this ability to manage the inner critic and the fear versus the positivity and that champion voice. And there was no training on it. They just said, no, this is how we do it. And I said, well, if that can work for you at 20 and 21, this can work for my 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old leaders. And that's why mindset is so very important. And making sure that you're not sabotaging. I always say, who's got the microphone in your head? And is that messaging positive or is it sort of crushing you? Because that will have an impact on your quality of your life.
That's very interesting you say that because I know when I was doing recruiting for EY, I noticed that we in the past that we're selecting candidates that all excelled in some kind of athletic sport. They were the top in their game in some kind of sport, and I was one of those. I played racquetball, competitive racquetball, and to speak exactly what you're talking about. After reading the book, The Inner Game of Tennis, that talked about that mind, I went from a B player to an open player in about a year's time after perfecting, quieting that mind. So I can relate to that, and I can see where that can be very beneficial in the workplace as well as, and that's how I also helped with my transition. It's just trying to keep that voice quiet,
and you're right, and that's a big piece right now. Is really mindfulness, right? And my graduate degree is in counseling psychology, but there was a holistic element to it, right? And the professor said, you're not going to be able to use this word holistic for a couple of decades, but it's coming. And the whole point of that is we if you look at the billions in stress-related disorders, right, we can't be working harder, and that's why, in part, I think we've got that Bloomberg report that came out that just simply said, for a lot of folks, they want life. They're taking the life is short mindset to have it under their own control, and it's not about doing more. When I say productive, I don't mean exhausting. I mean that you're having time for yourself, that you're being able to be reflective in the course of your day, that you're being able to work on your body, you're being able to be healthy. I've seen, unfortunately, too many of the type A players where the wake-up call was the heart attack or the stroke. Before they got the message, they had to change it. And so certainly as we enter the third act of life, this is about the opportunity of really having an integration of your productivity that's fueling you, and it's taking care of your body, and it's taking care of your mind for a life well lived.
I just saw a documentary on the past Olympians and how they're dealing with stress related to what happens after winning a gold medal, and how there's a tendency for some pretty stressful situations, including suicide. And I found it fascinating, but at the same time, it did seem a little odd that they were like reaching out to the world saying, we didn't have a pension plan. We didn't have help, after the transition. We didn't have, there seemed to be a lot of complaining about something that they, as an athlete, they should know better. And as an independent mind thinker, that they should have taken the responsibility for themselves. And now with resources like what you do and with retirement plans and what you do, Matt, I mean, I don't think there's any excuse like that anymore where they can't find help for something like that. They don't need an Olympic committee to help them. Is the bottom line. And so maybe we leave with that, is that you got to take the bull by the horns sometimes and set your own direction and seek help for,
That's right.
in your
That's
retirement.
Right. Yeah. It has to be a team sport, regardless of the age of life. To isolate is a lonely story, and that's a whole different narrative, what you're pointing to, because we've always seen Olympians as just stainless steel tough, and now we're seeing the human side of the story, right? And they spend all their life so intensely, and then it's quiet. It's much like what we've talked about in this episode around 30 years of full-time scale, career, and then the next day, crickets, right? So it needs to be a team sport, asking for help, seeking the resources to ensure that you're, as I said earlier, being able to live your best version of yourself.
I agree.
So, Allan, when we're looking at what you call pro-tirement, in let's say 2 minutes or less, I know there's executive coaches out there. Why would somebody want to work with you, and why would they want to work with Questage?
Great question, and we're very clear, we're not for everybody. So we've been using the Olympic metaphor. So we're very niched, we're very focused, based on where we've played, and I feel so privileged to have had the opportunity to be in the arena with really bright, smart leaders. And so for Questage, it's really for that leader who's listening to your podcast, that's leaning in and going, I'm curious. That would be that's a clue intuitively that we might want to have a conversation. We have mastermind programs as well as one-on-one programs. And again, we try to make it really easy because we're not for everybody. So going to the website and taking the Are You Ready is probably the quickest way to take a minute of your life and respond. And I'm very much about paying it forward. So I know that we're not for everybody, and we have a lot of external resources to support listeners so that they can have exactly what we've talked about in the show.
Very good. Allan, we really appreciate you taking the time to come on today. It was nice getting to have a chat back and forth with the three of us. Jeff, was there anything you want to add in here before we say goodbye to Allan for the day?
No, but I appreciate your your advice and look forward to maybe using your services someday. So,
Excellent. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Good luck to what you do. It's important, and I appreciate having this time with you.
Absolutely. Listeners, that's all for today. So let's go out and make the rest of our lives the best of our lives. Thanks for tuning in.
The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide or construed as providing specific investment advice. Any economic forecast set forth in this podcast may not develop as predicted, and there can be no guarantee the strategies promoted will be successful. All performance reference is historical and is no guarantee of future results. Investing involves risks, including the potential loss of principal. No investment strategy or risk management technique can guarantee return or eliminate risk in all market environments. Thanks for tuning into this podcast. California license number 0175638, NMLS number 1246224.